Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. Our quick hitter video will speed us to Alabama to see about a connection between new and old heists that we've already covered. Then hastily take us out to the Pacific Northwest for a more standard bank robbery. We'll see an Arkansas bank president kidnapped for ransom, a couple that embezzled from a bank, blamed a robber, and then disappeared, a fainting bank employee, undercover police, extradition from Minnesota, and more. So that's a lot to do at breakneck pace on this February 1927 Part 3, Decades of Heistery. We head to Alabama, courtesy of the Indianapolis Times in their February 1, 1927 edition. We see the title, Part of Bank Loot Recovered, from which we learn that part of a $5,500 that was acquired during the holdup of Paul Tolan, who was a livestock exchange bank messenger, had been recovered. Tolan was transporting the cash on a stockyard streetcar on January 21st, 1927. Detectives who we've come across in several Southern cases, Claude Worley and Charles Golnich, were both involved. Golnich was actually returning from Opelika, Alabama, where 24-year-old Carl Jennings, who'd been indicted for his involvement in that crime, was captured. He was being taken to Indiana for trial. The next day's Indianapolis Times showed the focus was on a confession since loot had already been recovered. It was learned that Jennings had bought a car for $616 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Then he gave away more money, gave away clothing, and even jewelry worth around $1,000 to a Mr. and Mrs. William H. Denham with whom he boarded. But the kicker is that Jennings gave a girlfriend $50 in order to buy a ukulele. For his part, Jennings did continue to deny involvement in the robbery, but the victim, Tolan, said Jennings was in fact the man who drove the bandit car. So grand larceny and auto banditry were added to his charges. More details may emerge, including, most importantly for our purposes, if Jennings was involved in the recent spate of bank heists in the Birmingham area that we noted in recent previous episodes. The Daily Alaska Empire, Seward Daily Gateway, and for the first time in the Decades of Heistery journey, the Nome Nugget, take us to Washington State, where another young man was in trouble. Thomas Hardy, 25, was captured on the evening of February 1st and confessed to his role in the heist of the Oakville, Washington Bank for about $10,000. Suspicion was aroused when he attempted to rent a vehicle other than the one he was currently driving. Apparently, a description went out for Hardy and possibly others because a garage man from whom he was attempting to rent a car identified him from a newspaper photo. The garage man called the police. When Hardy was picked up, he had around $2,000 on him. Unfortunately for him, the serial numbers on the currency matched with those that were stolen. Hardy, incidentally, whose real name was Thomas E. Conway, admitted that the other robber was a, quote, gunman and an ex-con from the Montana State Penitentiary. Hardy led officers to a cache where he'd hidden some of the loot, and according to the Olympia Daily Recorder, that equated to around $800 in silver and $5,000 in warrants and securities. The February 3rd Brownsville Herald brought us a front page story. Down at the bottom of column 8 ran Bandits Kidnap Arkansas Banker, and they provide us another erroneous, error-filled story. It seems that the president of the National Bank of Mansfield, Arkansas, was kidnapped from his home. It took place on the evening of February 2nd, when two unidentified men demanded that the bank president, named Graves, and his brother or brother-in-law, to be determined, get in the car. They pulled out and headed towards the Oklahoma line, stopping around 4 miles or so outside of Mansfield, at which point they dropped the brother brother-in-law off. Then they took President C.C. Graves to Howe, Oklahoma, where he was gagged and trussed and then planted in a deserted house. He managed to break free and escaped around midnight, located a telephone, and called back to Mansfield where he spoke with the operator. The operator then relayed the information to a constable and bank cashier named Andy Peavyhouse. Peavyhouse retrieved Graves and returned him to Mansfield, Arkansas. The unidentified robbers told Graves their intention was to hold him for a $3,000 ransom. Thankfully, the Daily Douglas Dispatch picks up on this story, adds some important details, and most importantly for our purposes, corrects a bunch of errors that were in the Brownsville Heralds. Based on the Brownsville Herald and the Daily Dispatch stories, this is what sounds like happened. The two robbers went to Graves' home, where they pretended to serve him a summons, at which point they drew revolvers and forced Graves and his brother-in-law, Frank Butler, into their car. They then headed to the bank, where they attempted to force Graves to open the vault, but he convinced them that he couldn't do it because the vault was set up with a time lock. Since that escapade didn't work, they indeed headed out of town and indeed dropped Butler off, but not before they demanded of Butler that he gather $30,000 for Graves' release, not $3,000. Graves, after his midnight kidnapping escape, indeed had called Mansfield, but it was an R.W. Barger, a town officer of some sort, and indeed a cashier at the bank, is the one who went and ultimately retrieved Graves. The almost opposing stories leave us to wonder who were these failed bank robber kidnappers and where they were. And my hope is that at that point they were repenting and considering new careers. Of course, we'll need to follow up more to find out. Well, nothing satisfies after a good kidnapping attempt like a bank embezzlement. For that, we'll reference the Imperial Valley Press, the Seward Daily Gateway, the Nome Nugget, the Daily Alaska Empire, and the Daily Douglas Dispatch. You can tell this is going to be a juicy story by the broad coverage, and you can see that it's going to be Western-oriented by the geography of the papers. We have Henry L. Bergman and Miss Harriet Weatherson, both officials of the State Bank of Florence, Oregon, who were charged with embezzlement on February 3rd. Weatherson reported on Thursday, January 27th, that a single solo bandit had entered the bank while she was there alone. The bandit allegedly took about $16,000, according to the Imperial Valley Press, but the Seward Daily Gateway suggests it was $28,000. State bank examiners did a check and found approximately $13,000 in cash gone and $7,000 in traveler's checks missing. However, Bergman, who happened to be more than an official of the bank, but the president of the bank, and Weatherson, that cashier, then disappeared, at which point warrants were issued. According to the Seward Daily Gateway, Weatherson disappeared from a hotel on Monday, January 31st. The Nome Nugget suggested that Bergman and Weatherson had been staying at the hotel and scrammed the same day. The Daily Alaska Empire provided a huge update for the lovers turned embezzlers with its February 14 Valentine's Day edition. Well, despite the fact that love was in the air, it seems that Bergman and Weatherson had now been arrested in Stafford, Arizona. The amount they allegedly embezzled had dropped down to $20,000. That day's edition of the Imperial Valley Press noted that the town was actually Safford, Safford. They also noted that the famous Burns Detective Agency, which we've noted before in previous stories, was on the job, and that they'd actually traced the pair from Eugene, Oregon, down to Fresno, California. It seems that they borrowed a car from Charles Ferris in Eugene, but then abandoned it in Fresno. The Daily Douglas Dispatch added that Ferris was a lumberman in Oregon and a friend of Bergman's. However, friendship be darned, as the car was, quote, in bad shape, evidently having been driven at a high rate of speed for some time, end quote. It appears that they'd sped straight through the night from Eugene, Oregon, down to Fresno, California. From Fresno, California, they boarded a train to LA. Somehow from LA, they angled their way toward the Arizona-Mexico border and the small town of Safford. Those same Burns detectives who traced the lovers also discredited Weatherson's story of being locked in the vault pretty quickly. They added that Bergman had been in Portland, Oregon at the time of the alleged heist. Importantly, Bergman and Weatherson had been brought in for further questioning and were going to face even more the next day, but disappeared that evening. In an odd twist, Carl Bergman, Henry's brother, returned traveler's checks and some cash to the bank. He said that his brother had called and told him where it was hidden. In an odder twist, Graham County, where Safford, Arizona is located, their sheriff's office, and an M.T. Stinson, who was a night watchman, said that the county jail was empty and that they'd not even heard of Bergman and Weatherson when they were asked by reporters. So how will these white-collar criminals be treated? This will be interesting to find out, and so we'll need to follow up on them for sure. The Sunday Star ran a title, Woman Bank Cashier, Facing Holdup, Faints. Wakes in Vault, Bandit Gone. The bank of Ivanhoe out of Wythe County, Virginia, had been robbed of over $6,300 in currency and other valuables on February 5th, 1927. A Mrs. John E. Huddle, Huddle, was cashier during the holdup and faced a pistol in the masked robber's hand. She immediately fainted and awoke at some point in the vault. Apparently, the heist happened between 11 a.m. and noon, yet she was released from the vault about 2 p.m. Her husband, president of the bank, was in Wytheville, Virginia at the time of the robbery. Poor Mrs. Huddle was in a, quote, highly nervous condition following her release. The police reckoned that 3 men had pulled off the job since 3 strangers had been spotted in town shortly before the holdup. Their getaway car did not have a license tag. We now go from a nervous cashier to a gutsy undercover trooper and head to Pennsylvania. The Evening Star brought us a story titled Posing as Thief, Trooper Nips Plot. It's subtitled Becomes Member of Band of Diamond Robbery Suspects and Learns of Holdup Plan. On the night of February 7th, we see 5 men in jail. 2 had been involved in a bank holdup of the Clarion County National Bank at Knox, Pennsylvania. They were Sam Earle and Ed Guy, both of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and undercover Pennsylvania State Trooper Vincent Bridge, known as Smith, to the gang. Smith had been given the task of acquiring a vehicle for the heist, so he had a banker put a vehicle on the street for him to steal. Bridge, that's Smith, Earl, and Guy collaborated and stole the car and then headed to Knox, Pennsylvania. When a clerk opened the bank doors, the robbers went to a nearby home where a cashier lived. They forced him, under cover of pistols, to walk to the bank, retrieve the money, and hand over $8,000. The robbers were unaware that all the bank employees were told not to resist. The robbers then herded all the bank workers together, guided them back to the cashier's house, but along the way were overtaken and surrounded by state and county officers. 3 other men were in jail in Newcastle, Pennsylvania on suspicion. They included Mark Hockman, William Mattison, and Harry Coburn. All 5 of those in jail were suspects in the $10,000 diamond heist that occurred in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. So for more on this, we'll need to follow up as details emerge. However, the Evening Star ran a broad article titled, quote, Undercover, end quote, Men Engaged in Entrapment Hit by Press. The story was an editorial and questioned the tactics and the analysis of the tactics by major newspapers from around the country. Tactics they were looking at were using undercover agents and wiretapping. It considered the legal and ethical issues and focused primarily on the prohibition aspect of crime. The majority of the papers seem to fall on the side that using undercover tactics where agents came perilously close to or even broached into actually committing crimes themselves was wrong. However, a couple of papers did see things differently. The New Bedford Standard noted the Pennsylvania trooper who, quote, in an effort to solve a diamond robbery, joined a gang of bandits, end quote, that would be our Vincent Bridge, quote, took part in the planning of a crime with a view to clinching the case against the criminals, end quote. That would be the bank robbery that he was involved with. They concluded, quote, we have no doubt that he will be heartily commended for his success, end quote. Approve or disapprove of the tactic, we'll definitely follow up to see more on this gang of 5 diamond robbers, and we'll see hopefully more on Bridge and how things work out for him as well. Now on to Minnesota, where we see that extradition papers were set in order to return an Alvin M. Danieliski, alias A.M. Daniels, who was an automobile dealer, and a Samuel Kroman, Kroman, who was an attorney. It's a strange pair to be committing a robbery. Yet, they were wanted for the $271,000 Liberty Bond heist from the J.F. Wild Company Bank in Minnesota. This robbery occurred back on November 19, 1926. Detective Chief Claude M. Worley received information from local detectives Reynolds and Jordan, which he believed would, quote, result in a complete solution, end quote, of the case. So it's definitely not looking good for this pair of white-collar criminals. Again, it'll be interesting to follow up on the white-collar criminals and see their sentences versus the more brute force style of bank robbery. Lastly, in the true spirit of the quick hitter, we see a Dillard Brooks, who was wanted for his role in the heist of a Valera, Texas bank. He'd been located in California, where he was being held for a similar case. That's it. So we'll follow up for sure on Dillard Brooks to see if they're more forthcoming with at least a little bit more information. We'll follow up on the embezzling lovers and see how things work out for them. Hopefully we'll locate the failed robber kidnappers, as well as all the rest of the people that we've talked about along the way as information becomes available. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. By